Okay, so I have a confession to make. Recently, I sold all of my photography gear, which for a Micro Four Thirds user, that basically meant I sold all of my Micro Four Thirds cameras and lenses and then got myself a new camera. Now, I suspect that you might be thinking, oh, this guy finally realized that his Micro Four Thirds gear is just not good enough and decided to upgrade to a new camera. I can assure you that is not the case. So let me tell you the whole story. And for those of you itching to upgrade to a new camera, you might want to hear me out. A few months ago, I had to move to a new country because I was pursuing my PhD. As part of that process, I decided to sell off a lot of my stuff so that I could build up a decent chunk of change because, well, moving to a new country can be a daunting experience. So I thought that would be the best course of action. So that included selling off my photography gear, which I did. Fast forward a couple of months later, I had an urge to get back into photography, and my camera phone was just not cutting it. By that point, I actually have already decided to get the Olympus EM1 Mark II, simply because it's an awesome camera, and pair that with the Sigma 3.0 f1.4 prime lenses. With that setup, you're basically set. You've got a great camera with great features, face detection autofocus, face tracking autofocus, pro grade build, great battery life, pleasing colors, and with the Sigma Trio, you get that shallow depth of field, great low light performance, and superbly sharp images. However, as I gave it more thought, I began to realize that, wait a minute, I'm not actually tied down to any system. This could well be my only chance to try out a new system. Now, even though practically speaking, Micro Four Thirds is still the best choice for me, but I just can't help myself. I'm really curious as to how it feels like, what it's like to shoot with another system. Maybe I could try Fujifilm. I've always been a fan of their colors. That's something to think about. Maybe I should try Sony with their amazing autofocus. That could come in really handy. But as excited as I was about the prospect, I needed to approach it logically. The last thing that I want to do is waste money on unnecessary purchases. So to do that, and this pretty much applies to everyone, you just have to ask yourself the question, what is it that matters the most to me? For those of you who have been doing photography for a while, that would be a fairly simple question to answer. All you need to do is just take a look at the photos that you've been taking, and that should give you some clue. For those of you who are new though, well, my advice to you would be to just stick with the gear that you have and keep on taking more photos. And I think eventually you'll figure it out. Now, in my case, I like to take photos of my family. I do a lot of astrophotography, and occasionally I dabble in street photography and landscape photography. In terms of lenses, I take most of my photos with prime lenses, particularly the 35mm and 85mm focal length full frame equivalent. Please do keep in mind that me saying that essentially contextualizes this whole discussion and the eventual conclusion of this video to my specific use case. So with that out of the way, let's continue. So the question now evolves into, what is it that I need gear-wise that could help me optimize the kinds of photography that I do? The answer to that is basically your ideal setup. So my ideal setup would be one that is capable of reliable face tracking autofocus, excellent ISO performance, and excellent dynamic range. On top of that, whatever system I choose should have fast but affordable options for the 35 and 85mm focal length. So since I'm willing to spend about $1,500 on the Olympus EM1 Mark II with the Sigma Trio, that basically defines my budget. If I have to spend more than that, then I might as well just get the Olympus EM1 Mark II with the Sigma Trio. It's a great setup, with the only weakness being the ISO performance. It's not bad, but it could be better, I guess. With a bit of research and referring to charts from photons2photos.net, I've narrowed down my choices to 3. The first one being the Sony A7iii. Pros include amazing face tracking autofocus, IBIS, excellent ISO performance, and you can also get the Sigma Trio with that camera. For the cons, I would say it's the price, because it's actually not a cheap camera for what it is. Additionally, dynamic range, even though it's a bit better than the Olympus EM1 Mark II, I would say it's comparable. There isn't a clear-cut winner when you compare it to the Olympus setup. My second option would be the Fujifilm X-S10. Pros include Fuji colors, IBIS, good ISO performance, and it's really well priced. You can now also get the Sigma Trio lenses in the X mount, which is great. On the other hand, the cons would be the dynamic range, which is just comparable to the Olympus dynamic range, and its face tracking at best is equivalent to what the Olympus offers. So again, there's no clear-cut winner here. My third option would be the Sony A7iii. The pros include Sony face tracking autofocus, IBIS, excellent ISO performance and dynamic range, and plenty of cheap third-party lens options. Great form factor, at least for what I'm looking for. It's not as ergonomic as the Olympus, but I still like it. It reminds me of the Lumix GX9 that I used to own. The cons, however, is a big one, which is that it's pretty dang expensive. And the lenses are potentially way bigger and heavier than what I'm used to, at least. Now, I'm not sure if I'd be comfortable with that, but considering that I am at the very least looking for a camera with 2 prime lenses setup, then I think it's still worth considering. If there's anything I had to sacrifice, well, I guess it'd be the size and weight. Hypothetically speaking, if I could get any of these setups for the same or lower price than the Olympus setup, then I think A7C is the clear winner. But realistically speaking, that's never gonna happen. Or could it? For the past 2 months or so, I've been going on eBay pretty much every day, trying to find a good deal on the Sony A7C with no luck, obviously. But what I realized was that there were lots of Sony A7 IIIs for sale and on auction with starting prices that are quite low actually. And I'm guessing that's because of the newly released Sony A7 IV. So I came up with a strategy. Find an A7 III that looks good and just place my max bid from the very beginning. See what happens. Yeah. If I get beat, then so be it. So a couple weeks pass and my bid keeps getting beaten by a significant margin, unsurprisingly so. But then I came across this post. Now, the post was poorly done, and there were plenty of tiny red flags. The pictures were badly taken, the description was short and uninformative, but upon closer inspection, this guy was actually selling the Sony A7 III with the Rokinon 85mm f1.4, the Canon 50mm f1.8, and then a Canon zoom kit lens with the Yongnuo Canon lens to Sony E-mount adapter. Even though the title really only mentions the Sony A7 III. On top of that, this guy has been a member since 2019. And it seems like this is his first and only post on eBay. So putting two and two together, right? I was kind of betting that this guy was not a scammer and is just simply a guy who's a newbie at selling on eBay, perhaps. Even so, it still felt risky though. With that in mind, I put down a conservative max bid. And a few days later, I won. Although it didn't feel like I won, I was still quite nervous about the whole transaction. I was basically at risk of losing quite a bit of money. After 2 weeks of agonizing wait, it eventually arrived. The box was in questionable condition, but upon opening the box, everything I hoped was in there was in there. So that's a great start. But we're not exactly out of the woods yet. The next big question is it working? And what's the condition like? At first glance, I could tell you it was actually quite dirty, including the sensor. But it's okay, I cleaned it all up. And actually, in terms of wear and tear, there was very little signs of it. It was actually in pretty good condition. And did it turn on? Yes, so that's great. Are the lenses working fine? Yes. Great. But there's one final thing that needs to be checked. The shutter count. Now, this was the part that I was most nervous about. I even messaged the guy on eBay and I got no response. Yeah. So I did what needed to be done. I took a JPEG picture, uploaded it to a website that tells you what the shutter count is. So guess what the number is? It's 4,000. 4,000. Not 40,000. 4,000. It might as well be brand new. It's crazy. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was ecstatic. Oh, that reminds me, I should take this moment to pause and say that, for the love of God, please do not take what I'm saying, at least for the purchase part, as advice, okay? I'm just a very greedy, short-sighted person who takes unnecessary risks for things he doesn't need, yeah? And I got extremely lucky. So, what is it like moving to full frame from Micro Four Thirds? Let's talk about point number 1, size and weight. Now, it is significantly bigger and heavier than what I'm used to. It's not so bad though, but there's no way I can go beyond a 1 camera, 2 lens setup at this point. I can't even consider buying like a telephoto or super telephoto lens. Number 2, image quality. Now, this is where it gets a bit complicated, depending on how you look at it. Yes, it does have better ISO performance, and yes, it does have better dynamic range. There's also a kind of softness to the image. I don't know if you can notice that, but I find it quite pleasing actually. My guess is that it has something to do with the pixel size, which is about twice the size of what the pixels would be on a 20 megapixel Micro Four Thirds sensor. And then, of course, you get that extremely shallow depth of field. But even so, I cannot say for certain that the images I've been getting are better than what I've taken with my GX9, when paired with good lenses, of course. I mean, sure, yes, you get shallower depth of field and your highlights are less likely to be blown out, but that doesn't necessarily equate to a better image. Unless you think it does, then by all means, you do you. But I think the more important point is the next one. Autofocus. Is it autofocusing? Is it? I hope so. Yeah, it's great. What else can I say? I mean, it's not the latest version though, so it's not the best that Sony has to offer, but it's still pretty good. Now, can it still miss shots? Yes, of course, definitely. You still need to learn how to use the camera properly. Learn the autofocus settings, learn the menu, which, on a side note, the menu isn't as bad as people make it out to be. What's the deal? I mean, I'm someone who reads the manual. Understanding the menu was fairly simple and straightforward for me. Maybe I'm the weird one, I don't know. My final point is the shooting experience, which I consider to be very important. This isn't something that I can quantify very easily. All I can say is that I've thoroughly enjoyed using this camera. Do I enjoy it more than taking photos with my GX9? No. Actually, no, not at all. The only practical difference now is that I shoot more underexposed to protect the highlights. And I do that because I know I could comfortably push the shadows quite aggressively without sacrificing noise performance, which is nice. I appreciate that. But still, my GX9 was a really fun camera to bring around and take photos with and take videos with as well. Okay, so this video has dragged on for too long, so let me just say one thing. Going to full frame, it's not that big a deal. At least not as big a deal as I thought it would be. Not as big a deal as what YouTubers make it out to be. Now, let's be objective here. There are things that the full frame system offers you, but unless the kinds of photography that you do pushes the camera in such a way that you can benefit from the better ISO performance and better dynamic range and extreme shallow depth of field, then you probably wouldn't notice a difference. The takeaway lesson here is that if you're looking to upgrade, but there's no major flaw in the system that you're shooting with such that it hinders you from taking the photos that you want, then I don't really think you need an upgrade. Perhaps you could consider investing in a really good lens, because when you're talking about image quality, I think it's all in the lens. Okay, well, I think that's about it. So, what do you think of the new look? What do you think of the photos? Anyways, see you next time, I guess.